Many writers dive into their manuscript without a clear roadmap and then wonder why they can't seem to finish. But having a clear step by step process changes everything. In today's video, we're talking about every stage of the writing journey, and you'll learn how to take your book from idea all the way to a finished published manuscript. Hey, y'all, welcome to today's Live with Lisa. If you're new here, my name is Lisa, and I create videos that help you learn how to write and live God's way. If you want to honor God with both your life and your writing, this is the place for you. Every week, we go live in partnership with Our Given Purpose Ministries, which is an amazing ministry that helps you to grow in your walk with God. So make sure you follow them as well. So when we talk about the writing process, it feels like everybody has a different idea of what that means and what that looks like. And so today, I thought it would be helpful to outline and give you a high level view of what the writing process looks like from start to finish. So step number one is called brainstorming. Now, what is brainstorming? I want to talk about, as we go through each stage of the writing process, I want to talk about not only what it is, but also the biggest mistake I believe a lot of writers make during this part of the process. So brainstorming is what I would describe as creating the blueprint for your writing process, for your book, right? It's kind of like creating the blueprint for a house. You need to know where everything goes and how everything works together and make sure everything makes sense in order to build the house properly. You don't just dive into the building process, at least not if you want a house that's going to stand, right? We want to have a strong foundation. And so we need that blueprint in place. And that's what brainstorming helps us to do. It helps us to come up with ideas, and then we have something to work with. We know where we're going to go with the story, or at least we have some idea of where we're going anyway. And so we have some other steps in the process that will make it easier to understand where we're going, but we have to start with brainstorming first. Now, I would say during the brainstorming process, you want to identify things like who you're writing for, what your message is, and the why behind your work, why you're writing, what your big why is. But there's a lot of different parts to brainstorming, but that's kind of the gist of it. Now, the biggest mistake I believe many writers make during the brainstorming process is that they skip it completely. They don't think it's really necessary because they don't think of it as real writing. They kind of imagine that writing starts later, and so they don't realize that they need to do brainstorming first. And I want to encourage you to check out a live stream I did earlier this year talking about the brainstorming process and why it's so important. It's called The Critical Step Writers Miss After Getting a Book Idea. So I'll have the link for that in the description. So make sure that you check that out for more insight about brainstorming and how it really works. The next step in the writing process is the outlining stage. Now, a lot of people think that brainstorming, they may realize that that's important, but I would say even fewer people probably understand outlining and what it is and why it's necessary. Outlining is really giving your blueprint, your writing blueprint structure. So if we're going back to the house analogy, it might be adding those details and making sure that the blueprint is finalized, making sure that everything is exactly where you want it, and really making sure that everything has been cleared and ready to go before you begin the building process. So we have our blueprint, but the outlining process is where we refine it. And so outlining is really necessary as well. We don't want to just brainstorm and have a bunch of ideas and then not know which ones we want to include in the story. And so the organizing process, I should call it, I've been saying outlining and I meant to say organizing. The organizing process is where all of those ideas come together. Now, outlining is actually a big part of that process. And I think that's why I got those words mixed up. So I meant to say organizing. So the organizing part is really important as well. The reason why a lot of writers miss the organizing stage of the writing process is, again, they don't realize it's important. They may know about brainstorming, they may know about drafting, which we'll get to in a second, but they don't realize that organizing your ideas is just as important as brainstorming them. We want to make sure that we include well. We want to make sure that we include the process as well. Let's check out the comments for a second here. I have some, but let's go through the rest of the writing process. So next we have the drafting stage. And the drafting stage is critical because this is what so many people think about when they think about the writing process. They think about drafting. They think about sitting down and just typing away, or writing if you prefer to handwrite. And so this is what really giving the writing blueprint its just executing on it, right? We have our plan. We have our plan in motion. We have it set. We know what kind of book we want to write. And drafting is when we execute on that plan. That's when we start to build. And this is the stage that I think a lot of writers get the most excited about. There is something just so encouraging, so motivating and uplifting to really sit down and finally start putting words on the page. And I get that. I feel that myself. And so I can relate. But remember, we need to do the necessary work in advance before we get to this stage. So this is when we execute on those plans we've made. I like to say that brainstorming and organizing are the parts of exploring the story, but drafting is when we tell it. Drafting is when we execute on those plans that we've made earlier. Now, the trap that a lot of writers get into with the drafting part of the process is they edit as they write. They want to make their first draft perfect. And that, I believe, is the biggest mistake a lot of writers make. And it's also why they never end up finishing their books, because you can get in this endless cycle of revision where you go over the same chapter over and over and over again, and just kind of keep going over it and keep tweaking it, and you never end up moving the book forward. And so the drafting phase is not where we polish. It's not where we make changes to spelling. It's not where we look at grammar or typos or anything like that. It is just where we get the words out. That's it. And so many writers need to be aware of that and understand that that changes your approach to the process when you understand that the goal is not a perfect draft. The goal is a finished draft. And so we need to make that distinction. We need to make that difference and understand how important that difference is, because that is a key thing that will help us go from constantly being in revision and editing mode to finally having a finished work. As author Jodi Picoult likes to say, you can't edit a blank page, right? And so that's the idea we have to keep in mind when it comes to drafting. The goal is just to get it done, just to get the words out, have it be messy and all, and then we fix it later. All right. All right. Let's look at those comments again. Okay, so Tori says, so true. I have skipped the brainstorming process in the past and then got stuck at the beginning and the dust started to collect. Yes, Tori, I'm so glad you said that. And thank you so much for sharing that because I think you have a lot of company. I have definitely been in that role myself and in that situation. And it you kind of leaves you scratching your head. You're like, well, what did I do wrong? It's not that you did anything wrong. It's that there was a part of the process that maybe we skipped and we didn't realize was so important and necessary. So I can absolutely relate to that. And that's why we're going through the process today. And that's why I'm excited for what I'll be sharing later on in the video today to really give you more insight about that. So thank you so much for sharing. All right, so we talked about drafting, which a lot of writers are really encouraged by, and that's what they get excited about. But the next step is also extremely important as well, and that is the editing and the revising phase. The editing and the revising phase. This is the difference between a good book and a great book. In many cases, in so many cases with so many books, the difference between that truly great book that we remember, that we love, that we come back to over and over again is the work that we do in revision. When we're editing that manuscript and we're really going through everything and we're looking at the story and trying to figure out whether everything makes sense, whether it it works together, whether it's telling the message that we want to share or not. And we make those changes that really help everything to be cohesive and work the way it should. That is the big difference. And again, we all start out with those messy first drafts. That's okay. And that's a part of the process. But this is the part where the book really starts to take shape and starts to look like it finally should, and where we make those big changes that make all the difference. So this is such a key and critical part of the writing process, and it's one that we can't afford to skip. So in many cases, the editing and revision process, it involves making big picture structural changes first, and then drilling down and making smaller technical line by line, sentence by sentence changes. And so the trap that a lot of writers get into is they try to do all of the changes at once. They try to do all the changes from start to finish and go through the manuscript, making all of the changes in one pass. And that is a huge mistake because you miss a lot of things that way. And it's easy to get very overwhelmed, which I believe a lot of writers do. So we have to take time to understand how the revision and editing process even works, first of all, and what is actually involved at each step of that phase. And so that's really important to understand, to be clear on, and to make sure you're going through the process properly. So understand that writing, that editing has multiple stages, multiple passes that you go through, and to not try and do everything all in one pass. That is so important and critical. Now, the next phase of the writing journey is what I like to call the polishing phase. You could also think of this as the proofreading phase. But this is where it is the final pass before publication. And this is the time when you really want to focus on making minor changes, not major ones. The polishing phase, or proofreading, it can include that as well, is where you're looking at making minor changes, not major ones. This is not the time to take chapter 4 and make it chapter 7, right? This is not the time to just completely change the ending, right? This is not the time to rearrange your chapters and put them all in different order and make big, massive structural changes. That's in the previous stage. This is where you're really looking to make sure you've dotted every I, literally, and sometimes, and make sure you've crossed every T, sometimes literally, and just making sure that all those final changes, all those final adjustments that need to be made have been made. And so it's if we're looking at this in terms of buying a house, this would be, and you're building a house, this would be when you're doing that final walkthrough and that inspection to make sure that everything looks the way it should. And it's just making sure that anything that you weren't aware of before, you're taking care of it now, but you're really looking for those smaller changes. You're not looking for those massive things that are going to just completely overhaul the whole manuscript. So the trap here for a lot of writers is that this is where a lot of people can get caught in perfectionism. They stay stuck in this phase of just saying, well, I just need to change this one little thing. And then, well, there's just one more thing here, and overthinking. That's a big piece of this as well. You get stuck in this mode of, well, should I make chapter 3, chapter 4? Should I make this line here? What about this word? Is this really the right word I should use? And we get stuck in this cycle of just analysis paralysis, overthinking, over questioning, second guessing every single decision. And this is where accountability can be really helpful. Because accountability is someone looking you in your eyes, hopefully over Zoom or in person, and being like, hey, you have this deadline coming up. We need to make sure we're moving this forward. Let's talk about how we do that. And I believe accountability is important at every stage in the writing journey, but particularly here when it's time to really move forward toward publication and really take those steps of making this book a reality. Accountability can be especially helpful because it helps keep us from getting stuck in this trap of perfectionism and looking to make a perfect book. Can I shatter some dreams and some myths for you for a minute here? There is no such thing as a perfect book, except I would argue the Bible, right? But in terms of a book that we have written, or outside of that, right? There is no such thing as a perfect book that we can create, right? This is a book that we produce, and it is the best book that we can create in this moment in time. It is the best book that we can write, that the Lord has given us the strength to write, and that we are trusting him to move forward with. And at a certain point, we have to move forward in that obedience, right? And so if we're trying to create a perfect book, then we'll stay stuck there forever and we won't actually move forward. But if we understand that done is better than perfect, and that good is better than not finished, then we're okay with having an excellent book, a high quality book that is done, but may not be perfect in that sense, whatever sense that we're thinking of. And it's so important, I think, for writers to understand this. We have this vision in our minds, many of us, especially if we're intentional about creating a vision for our books. We have this vision of what we think our books are supposed to look like. We have this vision, this idea of what we think it's supposed to be and what we think the end result should be for our books. And that's good. That's okay. God has given us a vision for our books that we're writing in partnership with him, hopefully, right? But the problem is, there's always going to be a disconnect between our idea in our minds and the actual physical book that comes out into the world. They're never going to match completely. They're never going to be identical to each other. There will always be a level of disconnect between the vision we have and the actual reality of our books that we're creating. And so when we get to the point where we're finally able to make peace with that and to accept that there's going to always be a level of difference between what we envision in our minds and what actually comes to pass, what actually ends up being published, then we have peace with that and we can move forward. But as long as we're trying to make those two ideas exactly the same, we're trying to make our vision the exact reality that comes to pass and that is published into the world, then it's going to be impossible for us to move forward. So we have to be settled in that. We have to accept that reality that our vision is not going to be exactly the same as the book we publish, and that's okay. That's perfectly fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. Every writer, every creator, every artist, I believe, goes through that same journey. And when you get to the other side of that and you're able to release that and let it go, knowing it doesn't completely reflect what was in your mind when you came up with the idea, then you're able to still find joy in the process and to appreciate the finished work for what it is. It's important to know that the finished work is always going to be a little bit different than what you envisioned. To accept that and to be okay with it is a part of the writing journey as well. All right, and that brings us to the last stage of the writing journey, the writing process, which is publishing. This is the actual logistics of either traditional publishing or self-publishing, depending on which path you choose. And so this is things like, sending, if you're traditionally publishing, this is like sending your book to a literary agent and looking to try and get published and get representation through a literary agent. And if you're self-publishing, this looks like actually handling all of the work of the publishing process yourself. Now, the different process, it's a different process depending on which path you choose. And some writers, some experts will try and convince you that one path is just always better than the other. They will try and convince you that one path is right for everybody and the other path is not. I'm not someone who believes that. I believe that you need to choose the path that works best for you. And it depends on what your goals are, what's most important to you, and what you really are able to do, even financially. All of that plays into the decision that you need to make. And so the trap that I believe a lot of writers get into in this part of the process is that they just assume that they have to publish a certain way without understanding the pros and cons of both paths. I think that's really important and something that a lot of experts that teach about writing, they skip that, or they kind of have their preference and they lean into that preference. And I think that's okay to a certain extent. They may have their own things that they did. Maybe they published themselves and they went the traditional route, or they went the self-publishing route. But I think it's really important and necessary for writers to know the difference between the two and really be clear on that difference before they make a decision. Because there are things that they may not understand about the path that they've chosen because they didn't really look into it that much. They just made a decision and moved forward. And so a lot of people, for example, might choose traditional publishing because they think that it's more prestigious. They think that they'll be able to get more awards or be able to get their books into libraries better and or into bookstores easier. But the reality is actually that you can do a lot of those things through the self-publishing route as well. And so if you know that, then you have a different understanding, and that might affect your decision that you make. Same thing with self-publishing. Many writers assume that self-publishing is prohibitively expensive for them, that they might not be able to afford it. But actually, if you're doing the research, you understand what's involved with self-publishing, you may realize maybe it's not as expensive as you thought it was going to be. Or the reverse, maybe it ends up being costing more than you were thinking, and you need to do a little bit more planning before you move forward. Regardless, like I said, I believe that there is no one right way to publish that is right for everyone. Everyone needs to make their own decision based on what's best for them and their situation. So it's important to recognize that, to be aware of that, and to really do the research to understand both publishing paths so you can make the right decision for you and for your book. So with that being said, we've walked through all of the stages of the writing process from beginning to end. And you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed in this process, and I wouldn't blame you. But I want to encourage you, because it's one thing to have a high level understanding of the writing process and what it looks like, to know all the steps are involved. There's another thing entirely to walk through that process and to have a clear plan, a clear roadmap, I would say, to lead you through the entire process from beginning to end. To have someone essentially holding your hand through the process and walking you through every step of the journey. And that is what the writer's roadmap is for you. It is a resource that I've created that really walks you through the entire writing process, all the steps I laid out today from beginning to end. It has clear, practical applications, practical exercises that can walk you through each of the steps of this process that we covered today and help you avoid a lot of those traps that we talked about today as well. And so there's no guessing, there's no wondering what comes next or what I need to do with this book or with that book or what this looks like. It's really just explaining everything and laying it all out and giving you the clarity and this clear steps that you need. So I want to encourage you to be on the lookout for that resource. It is coming to you very, very soon in the coming weeks. And so I have a link for you in the description to go ahead and get on the wait list if that sounds like something that would be helpful for you. Again, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of resources, a lot of ideas and opinions that people have about the writing process. But it might be helpful for you to really have that step-by-step process, that step-by-step roadmap that will lead you through the process from beginning to end. You don't want to have to gather a bunch of bits and pieces of information from all over the internet, but it can be so helpful to have something that will really walk you through each part and to give you those clear steps for every step of the journey and really have all of that in one place. And that is what the writer's roadmap is for you. So again, the link below is in the description to get on the wait list, and then you will be one of the first people to find out when that resource is being made available. So you can take advantage of that. And that will help you in your own writing journey. So I hope that this was helpful for you to really have this process and to have these clear steps of what it looks like to walk through the writing process and the writing journey. And I hope that it really encouraged you in your own writing journey. If you're feeling a little bit stuck and a little bit lost about what to do next, this will help you. So thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for watching, whether you're watching live or on the replay. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you on the next Live with Lisa, same time next week. Until next time, take care, God bless, and happy writing, y'all.